okay, no, no.
All right. So after today's, well, I don't think first period got it, but the rest of you, well, no, I wasn't. They weren't awake, so I didn't dare give it to them. But I am not all that impressed with what you guys were able to remember from the Gilded Age. That was not inspiring. So it was very sad. I just felt like I've never taught it. Okay, so remember our deal. Our deal is that you're quiet. You may certainly ask questions, but we are here to do busy stuff because 1 week from today, we are going to be taking this test.
Don't ask for the destination attendance.
Yeah, please don't. That's on tape for eternity, by the way. Okay.
So is my.
So Franklin is going to put it on
open
YouTube. And if you want to go back, I know that I looked at poor Casey's face the other day, and he just finally put his stuff down and just sat there. So I know I talk fast. I truly am sorry about that, but it is one of those things where if I don't do it fast, we'll be here for the next week. So what I'm going to try to do is to go through, again, kind of like I did last time, sort of to show you the themes. And it's really your job at this point to, after we go through this, to go back over and review it. Because I can't say it 12 times like you need it. So your job is to go back over and do the review. Okay? So everybody ready to go? Okay, last time we ended, we stopped with the, and I'm going to go back over the Mexican-American War. So we're going to start sort of in the middle of Polk's term. So one of the things I would suggest that you do, some of these really important presidents, like Polk, you need to go back over and kind of review why he's important. And most of you, that is one of the presidents you remember because he only had one term, but he did whole lots of stuff. So you go back and review that. Remember, Adam Norris is a great way to do that. And Sophia, I'm not going to be able to teach if you're talking. 1776. All right. So here we go. All right. So I'm going to start in, and the way I kind of have written it here is called the Road to the Civil War. Even though this is considered the antebellum period, is that the same thing as Road to the Civil War? Yes. Yes, it is. Antebellum. Don't forget antebellum. What does the market industries mean? Alex, what is market industries? If I use that term.
It's the period of time where industrialization.
Yes, industrialization. I almost used the word for you. Market revolution is usually what they call it. So you want to remember that that's about industrialization. And Alex, when is that? What period?
Is it after the first? Not in the 19.
We've already done it. 1820s, when we have transportation, industrialization, all of that comes together. Okay? So, again, vocabulary is really important. If I say peculiar institution, what is that? Slavery. Love. That's right. Oh, there's so many special moments, aren't there? Okay, so, peculiar institution. If I say popular sovereignty, that means people being able to vote. Right. Okay, so antebellum period is the period we're talking about. It overlaps with Polk's term. Polk's term, we usually think of him as Mr. Manifest Destiny. Good job. Mr. Manifest Destiny. But it also kind of coincides with the antebellum period. So they can be two things. All right, so we're going to talk about Mr. Polk first and then go into, and a lot of people think that the Mexican-American War is the first step toward the Civil War. So if you had a question such as, how does the Mexican-American War lead to the Civil War, you would answer it saying, okay, this is the first time we get a big chunk of land, and remember, you can look at that on your map. You have that map that shows the different parts of the United States and how we got them. And that big chunk of land, what do we do with that big chunk of land? Is it going to be slave? Is it going to be free? Are they going to have popular sovereignty? So the idea of this is one of the first steps. And remember, Mr. Clay dies in 1852, so he's getting toward the end of his compromises. So we're going to have some decisions to make about slavery. Okay, so we're going to start with the Mexican-American War. So we remember it with Polk, and Polk is a Democrat. You want to remember that. He's a Democrat. He is also called a dark horse because he comes out of nowhere and nobody imagines him becoming president. So he is considered a dark horse. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the Mexican-American War, but I think the most important part you want to think about is the Mexican-American War was done so that we could get California. And California was Polk's whole goal, was to get California as part of Manifest Destiny. Remember, he tries to buy he tries to buy California, but nobody wants to sell it to him. So he tricks the Mexicans into that area, the disputed area, and has a war. And remember, the only person that goes against it was Lincoln. They call it the spot resolution. Spotty Lincoln. As to what spot was the first shot, where's the first shot shot? So they determined what that was it was actually a setup by Polk and the American troops. Okay, so needless to say, we win. It really doesn't take that long, and really the people that come out of it that are beneficial, we have Zachary Taylor, and we have, can you think of anybody else that comes out of that? Well, Zachary Taylor's going to be president. Who else comes out of that that's in this particular thing? John C. Fremont, remember, he comes out of there and goes to California and starts the California sort of uprising to make California a republic just like Texas was. So we have some people that come out of that time period that are important. Okay, so we get that big chunk of land. It's called the Mexican Cession, including California, parts of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and that area then becomes really important to arguing over whether it's going to be slave or whether it's going to be free. Okay, now, with that argument, yes, Megan. The Mexican Cession, C-E-S-S-I-O-N. And what he says, what people say is, okay, let's make a rule about this big chunk of territory. Because the Liberty Party has already come into being. Liberty Party was the first party to actually talk about slavery as one of their platforms. Then we're going to have the Free Soil Party that's going to be coming out very soon in the 1840s that's going to say, you know what? Free soil, no more expansion of slavery into the territories. And that's what Lincoln's party is going to be before he becomes a Republican. Okay, so we have this whole land, and the first guy to talk about it is a guy named Wilmot from the House of Representatives, and he says, the Wilmot Proviso says, let's make this land no slavery. Let's make it no slavery. And of course that doesn't pass, but what it does say is it says we're going to talk about this issue. We're going to talk about whether Wilmot, the Proviso, really should have gone. Now, what they end up saying, Wilmot Proviso says, well, Mr. Wilmot supports the idea that let's let this whole area be slave-free. No slavery in this territory. It gets defeated in the House of Representatives. But the idea is, the importance of it is that it is a conversation. And it is one that they're going to have to answer. Okay, so part of this expansion is going to come up with the idea of popular sovereignty. And that's going to be Stephen Douglas's idea. And remember, Stephen Douglas is a senator from Illinois, same place Mr. Lincoln is from. And he is going to say, you know what? Let's make it individual popular sovereignty. And that means every single one of those newly created states is going to be able to vote on whether they want slavery or not. Now, popular sovereignty may or may not solve the problem, but it's going to be Stephen Douglas's panacea. The cure-all, right? We know that panacea means cure-all. So the idea that this is going to cure everything, this idea of popular sovereignty. Okay, so Free Soil Party comes out and says, you know what, we don't want slavery at all in that area. Popular sovereignty says let everybody vote on it. So there's a controversy. Okay, so out of this comes, in this particular part, comes the idea of the Compromise of 1850. So as time goes on, California comes in as a free state, and we don't know what to do because we don't have another state to balance it out like they did with Missouri. Missouri came in 1820. What's the other state that came out?
Maine.
Maine, right, as a free state. So now California's coming in. Remember, they're not a territory because they found gold, and there's so many people, they don't even go through that territory stage. So the idea is that California comes in as a free state, but we don't have a slave state to come in. So Mr. Clay says, all right, I've got an idea. The idea is let's let California come as a free state. Let's give the South something they want, which was a more strict or stricter Fugitive Slave Act, which means that you have to return those slaves that actually leave and try to escape to the north. It was an obligation that you sent them back. So the idea is the stricter one. Now, what was the incentive? Was that a judge actually got a kickback if he returned a slave, and if you didn't return it, you got a jail sentence and a fine. So it was a stricter Fugitive Slave Act. And remember, this was also the time when New Mexico and Utah got to choose whether they wanted to be slaved by popular sovereignty. New Mexico and Utah. So that is part of the Mexican cession. And there was also slave trade was going to be banned in the capital, in Washington, D.C. No slave trade. That doesn't mean no slavery. That means no slave trade. You're not going to put them on auction. Okay? So that's going to be the last compromise. So don't forget that. 1850. Compromise of 1850. Don't get it mixed up with 1820. That's 30 years earlier. I can do that math. All right, so now we're going to start on the march to the Civil War. And the first thing you're going to want to remember is the most important book of the time, which was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852. And remember, Harriet Beecher Stowe is this is the little lady that started the Great War. That's what Lincoln said about her. So the idea is she didn't know anything about slavery. She was a Northerner.
What was the name of the author?
Harriet Beecher Stowe. Yeah, you should know that like Eli Whitney. Okay, so the idea is that Harriet Beecher Stowe didn't know anything about slavery. She made a book that actually just told, in her mind, the bad things about slavery. Now, that's not the importance of it, though. The importance was that it was translated into many languages and was shipped off to Europe. And so lots and lots of people read it, and they then made sure that their governments did not support the South. Okay, that's the importance of it.
Wasn't it the second best-selling book of the time?
Besides the Bible. That's exactly right. Good for you, Max.
Yeah.
So the idea is that you want to remember, this keeps foreign nations out of the war, especially England and especially France. It kept them out of the war because of the pressure of the story. Okay, second thing you want to remember is the Underground Railroad, which you never forget. It's Harriet Tubman. And she's the most important one. Harriet Tubman. Don't get her mixed with Harriet Beecher Stowe. Oh, goodness. Okay, so Miss Tubman, she rescued about 500 slaves from the South and went to the North. Obviously important because she dedicated her life and pretty much her safety to doing so. Most people, if you're going to write an essay on slavery, escaped by boat. They did not escape with Harriet. Okay, most of them by boat because it was safer and you could actually hide better. So most people did that by going by boat. Okay, next one. The election of 1852 is an important one because it is the election. We had Taylor, but he didn't last very long. Then we have Franklin Pierce. We want to remember Pierce because Pierce was a Southerner. And if you remember, these are the times. Remember, I've told you this a number of times, but I'll tell you again. Pierce was the one you want to associate with foreign things. That things happened during his term where he supported the South in kind of down low kinds of ways. So what he did is he said, okay, this is when the Southerners decided that they were going to buy Cuba. And so they met in Belgium. What was it called? Austin Manifesto. So the Southern slave owners and the farmers, or the plantation owners, decided they wanted to buy Cuba so they could expand into Cuba. And of course, it turned into a fiasco. They got caught, and the northern abolitionists wrote all kinds of articles, and it fell through. But the part that you need to know is that this showed that the South was willing to do anything to expand slavery. Okay? So you need to remember that. It didn't work out, but they were willing to try to do that. Okay. Another thing about, again, I'll make sure I'm on task here. Next thing you want to know is about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay? Kansas-Nebraska Act was in 1856 or 1855, maybe a little bit earlier. Why don't we try 1854? Why don't we look at my notes? So, okay, so what happens in Kansas-Nebraska Act? You want to remember this because this is one of those things that builds up to the Civil War. Okay, Kansas and Nebraska are one big territory called the Nebraska Territory. Stephen Douglas, remember our friend from Illinois, wants to divide it into two states. One's going to be Kansas, one's going to be Nebraska. And he wants to run for president. So he wants to make the South and the North, both of them, happy. So what does he do? He says, I'll bet we can make this popular sovereignty, because he is the king of popular sovereignty. He says, Kansas will probably go slave because they're right next to Missouri, who is already slave. And Nebraska, it's way up there. It's going to go free. So we can make both parts happy. And then I can build a railroad through Chicago down into California, and I will bridge Chicago and make the center of the universe. Because remember, that is already where the cattle are being slaughtered, and it's becoming quite a capital for the meat industry. So he tries to divide the two, and what happens is Nebraska, no problem, they vote to go free, but Kansas has a bunch of those border ruffians that come over from Missouri trying to make it slave, but the majority of Kansas people don't want it slave. So they start about a 10-year war within Kansas over whether it should be free or a slave. And we call that Bleeding Kansas. And a lot of people look at that as the precursor or the mini Civil War. Because within Kansas are the abolitionists and the pro-slavery. Okay? Very important because you want to see that that is going to lead. Now, eventually Kansas becomes free, but not before there's all this fighting. Now, who emerges in this fighting besides Stephen Douglas? By the way, totally bad for Stephen Douglas. Now it makes him look stupid. Yes? John Brown comes out. Thank you. John Brown brings his sons, and they start killing those pro-slavery people, and he makes sort of a name for himself. Okay? So that is where he emerges, because he believes that God has decided he is going to get rid of slavery by himself. And so he has decided to do that. Okay, now, just so you know, just keep this straight. The Republicans then emerge. In about 1858, the Republican Party emerges. So I want you to, because Republicans and Democrats are so different from what they are today, I want to make sure you understand what they both stand for. Because it's almost the opposite, well, it is the opposite, of what they stand for today. In other, well, not exactly, but close enough. Okay, so Republicans, they do not want slavery in the territories at all. They are kind of like the Free Soilers, except they want to go a little bit further. And they want the new industrialized North. They are big supporters of the new industrialized North. They don't really care about whether or not people are treated fairly or not. That is really not an issue for them. What's an issue is they want no slavery, but they want the worker to be major. Okay, the Democrats, they want the extension of slavery. So they're going to be the southern plantation owners. And they think it's bad. One of the problems that comes out of this is that the small farmer kind of gets screwed over the whole thing, because the small farmer doesn't have any slaves. And we know from learning this that 3/4 of all farmers don't own any slaves. But the Democrats win the small farmers over by telling them that maybe someday you too could own a slave. So the Democrats sort of talk the small slave owners into kind of buying into the Democratic sort of vision. Okay, so, okay. Now, probably one of the most important things when it comes to sort of this antebellum period is the Dred Scott decision. And if we look at the Dred Scott decision in 1858, yes?
Around this time, how much would a slave cost about?
Depends. If it was a young man, it would cost about $25,000. Yes. Okay. All right. Well, that's our money. That's our money today. That's our money today. Okay. So Dred Scott, and remember, by this time, the Supreme Court has become very southern. And yes, 58. Okay. Don't forget, you guys, come on, focus. Okay, so 1858, it's become very southern. Remember, we've had Pierce, and now we're going to have Buchanan. So they are going to replace any of those Supreme Court justices with Southerners, because both of them, that's where they come from. So you're going to have, so they are very, when Dred Scott comes up, remember, John Marshall is long gone. We have a guy named Tawney now, and he is going to, his whole big thing is that he doesn't really, he wants to help the Southerners. So Dred Scott comes, and remember, Dred Scott is the slave who says, I should be free because I was in free territory. And Wisconsin. Or it was Michigan territory or Minnesota territory. Okay, any of those northern ones that start with an M. All right, so what you're going to say, and what you want to remember about it, is that number one, Supreme Court said Dred Scott is not a citizen. He shouldn't have even been able to bring this case to court because he's black and a slave. Number two is that there is nothing in the Constitution that says you can take property away from someone. The 14th Amendment says you cannot have your property taken away without due process. Slaves are property. And number three, the biggest thing is there is no place in the United States that you can keep slavery out of. Okay? So for example, if I have a slave and that slave goes to Wisconsin, he's still my slave. And therefore you can't take him away from me because he's mine. Just like a suitcase or anything else I own. So what does this tell you about popular sovereignty? Doesn't matter whether you make a law about it, because everywhere in the United States, slavery is okay. Is allowed. Okay? Yes?
I'm sorry, he couldn't sue because he
He was a slave.
I mean,
But
they
they
have to
went.
have a court case anyway, right, to decide all this?
Yes,
So,
yeah.
okay.
Well, they said it shouldn't have even come out this far. Okay, next one. Here we go. So, the next thing that happens, of course, is the election of 1860. And Lincoln, by this time, is the only Republican running. And there are three people, two Democrats, and a constitutional union candidate. So if you remember, what happens is, of course, Lincoln does not get his name on the ballot in the South at all. And yet he wins the election, the election by electors, because there's more population, voting population in the North. And therefore, they win the electoral vote. Now, he is a minority president because he gets less than 50% of the popular vote. Right. And he gets only 40%. But we don't elect our presidents on popular vote. We elect them according to the electors. So he wins the electors, but he gets less than half percent of the 50% of the vote. Okay? So as soon as he gets elected, yes. 60s? 1860. You guys should know that. That's like another one with all right. Okay, so as he's elected, the first state to secede is South Carolina under Mr. Calhoun. And they used the doctrine of nullification. We don't think this was constitutional, therefore we're out of here. So they used the doctrine of nullification. So with them comes a number of other states, such as Mississippi, Florida, I'm not sure you need to know all these, but Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Just think, all the really, really southern states, what we call the Deep South. And Virginia is going to not leave the Union until after the Fort Sumter. So there are only 3 states that stay in until after Fort Sumter. Virginia is one of them. And so therefore, when they actually leave the Union, it's after the last Union fort has gone to the south. Okay? All right? So Confederate states are organized, and their capital is going to be Richmond. First it was Montgomery, then they move it to Richmond. Of course, the United States is within 50 miles of that, which is D.C. They did it because they thought it was too isolated. Yeah, probably would have been better had they done that. All right, so let's talk about what do the North have as their advantages. Okay, first of all, obviously industrialized. You guys, if you're going to talk, you need to talk outside. Industrialized. They have a much bigger population, many more railroad lines, many more telegraph lines. They have a navy. South doesn't even have one. They already have a centralized government. South doesn't even have an organized one yet. And they have lots and lots of money, which of course the South doesn't have either. All right. Notice I did not say they had good military leadership. They did not. They had Lincoln. Of course, that was going to be important. And eventually they had Grant, but not at the beginning. Okay. They had advantages. South had some advantages. They had the home soil. They also had really good generals, which the North did not have. And all they had to do was keep the North out. Rather than, they didn't have to do any aggression. They just had to keep the North out. They had smaller everything. Smaller army, smaller amount of money, smaller navy, if any at all. Hardly any. We know how many roads they had, hardly any. We know they had hardly any railroads. We know they just didn't have much communication at all, hardly any telegraph lines. And, don't do that. Okay, and the Union had a plan. And what's, no, this is behind. The Union had a plan. It's called the Anaconda Plan. Remember after the snake? It has 3 parts to it. And I hope that you're thinking, you know, like about that as I'm talking about it. Okay, number 1 is to blockade the South. Think Gone with the Wind and Rhett Butler. Blockade the South. Keep the North, keep anybody from bringing things in, like the French or the British. Okay? Number 2, take over the Mississippi River and divide the 2 parts of the South. And the 3rd part is to take over Richmond. So if you're writing an essay on the Civil War, you would definitely want to include things about the Anaconda Plan. Did the South have a plan? Nope. All they had to do was be defensive and not let the North in. This is the Union plan. Okay, just think, strangling, snake. Try not to use other types of snakes. Okay, yes. Anaconda, A-N-A, C-O-N-D-A. All right, so what kinds of things do you need to know? What kinds of the battles? Remember, hardly any battles on the test. Hardly any battles. Only battles that have some kind of implications for them. So I would use Bull Run, the first Bull Run, which is only a few miles outside of Washington, D.C. in 1861. You want to remember that one because that's the one the South won, but they couldn't cash in on it. They didn't attack the Union. They didn't attack the capital. They just scattered. And what does it mean? It means that this is going to be a long war, and it's not going to be easy on anybody, especially the North. Okay, so that's going to be important. Second one that you want to remember is the Battle of Antietam, which is in 1862. You want to remember that one because Antietam is the bloodiest day of the war, which is, I think they had something like 25,000 people die in 24 hours. 62, September of 62. And you want to remember that because it is after that that the war becomes about slavery. Okay, so when you think about that date, you think, okay, so after that, the Emancipation Proclamation comes out, and Lincoln says, I got to make it about something. Bringing the Union together is not going to work. Bringing the Union together is not going to work to motivate anybody. So making it about slavery after Antietam might work. So that's the emancipation.
Is that when they find the coins in the
Yes, yes, yeah. Okay, so remember, one of the things that you want to remember about this one too, is that up to this point, Lincoln has, and is really important about keeping those border states in the Union. And remember, those border states are West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Delaware, and Maryland.
Wait, you should know your state abbreviation.
Can you do that again?
Okay, Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland. Okay. Now, you want to remember those because those are going to have Missouri? Yeah, and Missouri, sorry. I'm thinking Missouri. Maybe it's not Delaware. It's not Delaware. Get rid of Delaware, put Missouri in. I can't remember everything. Oh, stop it. Look it up yourself. Okay. All right, so listen up. So what does he do? Remember, Lincoln does some things that are a little bit questionable. Number one, he gets rid of habeas corpus. That means that you can be arrested and held without telling what you're arrested for. He also puts those border states under martial law. That means the military goes in there. But he also lets them keep their slaves. So that when he does do the Emancipation Proclamation, he only frees the slaves in the rebellious states. So he frees the slaves in the South, but he does not free the slaves in the border states because he wants to keep the border states in the Union. Okay? Very important because the border states have a lot of population, they have a lot of industry, they're just important. And Maryland is the capital, and you don't want your capital going to the wrong side. All right, the other thing you want to remember is the Merrimack and the Monitor. They are the first sort of clash between ironclads in 1862 also. The Monitor was the Union, the Merrimack was the South. And they basically, it was a draw, but the idea was they didn't go back to any kind of wooden ships again. So this is kind of the ironclad beginning. Okay. All right, so a couple of things. What did women do during the Civil War? Number one, women during the Civil War, a lot of them became nurses. Clara Barton became an important nurse. Is she really having a meltdown? Okay. All right, so had to become nurses. Women also became spies. Some of them fought, but not most of them. Most of them actually did become nurses or did some kind of volunteer work. The Southern women ran the farms. Because remember, when we talk about the draft, which is they had a draft on both sides, the Northern people weren't wild about the draft. In fact, they had draft riots. Remember, the Irish were drafted, and they had just come on the boat, and they were being drafted, and they didn't like it. And so a lot of them rioted because, remember, it was a rich man's war, a poor man's fight. And then in the South, the women took over because all the men fought. Because this was a gentlemanly war, and all the men were expected to fight. Even though they were exempt from the draft if they had more than 50 slaves. But remember, most people, if you had a slave, you had less than 10. So when you take your test, do not let the reader think you think that everybody owns slaves. Out of the third of the, what did I say, 2/3 didn't own any. So out of the third that did own some,
A lot of them own less than 10.
excuse me, 3/4. I'm sorry. I'm a little bit weird today. Okay, it's math too. Okay, go back over. 3/4. I said that before and I just misspoke this time. 3/4 did not own slaves. Out of the fourth that did own slaves, only a small portion looked like Gone with the Wind. Maybe 10 families. The rest of them would have owned less than 10 slaves. Okay, now that I redid that one. Okay, all right. Now, in the South, there were, happy birthday, there were food riots in the South. Food riots in the South. Southern women tried to scrape up enough food because there was a problem because everything was being blockaded. And also, remember, they didn't raise very much of stuff because they could always get it from other places. So most of the farms were not being worked because either the slaves left, and so there was a lot of problems with food. Okay, all right, decisive year. You want to remember 1863 is the most decisive year. That is the year of Gettysburg. And remember, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania is the most north that the South gets. The most north that the South gets. All right, meanwhile, now that makes it decisive. Meanwhile, during the 1860s, there is, 1863, there is a new political party that comes out, and they're called the Peace Democrats. And remember, they have their leader has that really awful name, Vallandigham. And the Peace Democrats, what snake are they? The Copperheads. Right, good for you, Amelia. So the Copperheads. And the Copperheads strike quickly and deadly. And remember, Vallandigham's idea is, I just want peace. I don't care who wins. I don't care. I just want it to stop now. And he was a pain. And remember the political cartoon that has the snake wrapped around Lincoln's leg? It's those Peace Democrats that are trying to keep him from doing what he wants to do. So he sends Vallandigham to the South. He goes up to Canada and tries to run for, Ohio governor and loses. Okay, or senator. All right, so let's talk about General. Yes. 63. Okay, now, in 1864, there's an election. It is not going well for Lincoln. If you remember correctly, hardly any of the commanders are winning anything for him. And of course, Lee is a much better commander, so he's winning battles, and so there has to be something strikingly happen. And that's when he finds the fact that General Sherman is willing to go from Chattanooga, Tennessee to the shores at Savannah, Georgia. And he takes a swath of that stuff and goes all the way through and kills everything and burns everything. And that's called Sherman's March. Okay? So, after that, there's the election, and because it looks like Lincoln is winning, the election is won by Lincoln. Against McClellan. If you remember, McClellan is the one he fired.
Twice.
Yes, twice. Tardy George. Okay, so after 64 election, it isn't long before Lincoln is assassinated, and Andrew Johnson takes over. But before Lincoln dies, he comes up with a plan for Reconstruction. And of course, you know, by this time, the North, you remember that little video I showed you, that 4-minute video? After Sherman's march, the whole thing falls apart. The Mississippi has already been weakened, and it falls apart, and they go in and get Richmond. So as the war is ending, then Lincoln is shot, but he already has a plan. It's called the 10% plan, where he's going to take 10% of each one of the states, and they can swear allegiance to the Union and come back into the Union. Okay, so that's called the 10% plan. But there's this other group in Congress that are called the Radical Republicans under Thaddeus Stevens. And Thaddeus Stevens wants to punish the South. So he comes up with his own plan, and it's called the Wade-Davis Bill. And the Wade-Davis Bill says we want 50% of those that are in the states to swear allegiance before they can come back in the Union. So Wade-Davis are 2 senators. They try to get, and it doesn't pass, but what it shows is there's a segment of the House that wants revenge on the South. Okay, so what do you need to know about Reconstruction? It starts right after the Civil War, and it ends with the election of 1876, at the end of military Reconstruction. Okay, so it starts with in 1865, ends in 1876. Now, Reconstruction is going to be a reconstruction physically of the South, but the South really remains, even though they call it the New South, they're going to add all these industries, really for the most part, it remains industrial. I mean, it remains agricultural, sorry. It remains agricultural. Now, how do we know that? Because what do most ex-slaves, what happens to them? They become sharecroppers. That means they go back to the same place they left, and now they have to pay rent and pay some of their crops to their new master. Okay, so you've got the sharecroppers, the blacks that are going to become sharecroppers. Most of the Southerners continue to rebuild their farms. Now, the North has done really well out of the war. They have made good money out of industry. First millionaire comes out of the Civil War, making munitions, of course. And they continue. The North has had very little happen to it. The South is just a mess. Freedmen's Bureau. You want to remember the Freedmen's Bureau. That's the group that was sent by the North to help feed, clothe, and give medical help to the South, to the ex-slaves, and to the white the poor whites, and also to give education. So that's the Freedmen's Bureau. So what's rising then? Freedmen's Bureau with the KKK is coming out. That comes under Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson is really a Southerner. He's a Unionist. That means he wanted to stay with the Union, but he's definitely a Southerner. So the KKK comes and starts to try to get blacks to go back to the farm, because remember, they don't have any help now. And the rise of the KKK happens. Even though Johnson sends the military later, it really does very little good. They're already entrenched. And you know, the KKK dies off, comes back, depending on the time period. Okay, so what happens to the some of the blacks in the South? Some of them leave and go to Kansas. They're called exodusters. That means they leave, they exit over the Mississippi River to Kansas to start a new life. Many of them become cowboys. Yes? EXO, duster. Yes? Go west. They go west. Some of them become Like if you look at cowboys are mostly black, or they're Mexican. So the cowboy become cowboys, or they go to the very west to try to look for gold. So you have blacks doing that, and you also have some blacks going up north to try to find jobs. But they're going to have a lot of competition. Because if you remember, what's the quote? The South likes the individual, but they don't like the race. The North likes the race, but not the individual. Right. So you want to remember that, because that's going to be consistent. They look like they're better, but in reality, when you look where the riots are, they're in the North. Because that's where the race issues come. All right, so we got the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, it's not working very well. Mainly because you've got these things called black codes. Black codes. And the black codes are the organized laws within a state that say what blacks can and cannot do. Number 1, they can't carry guns. Number 2, they can't hang out in groups. Number 3, they can't hang out past 10. And they can't live in certain places. They can't do certain jobs. So black codes are the first thing. They are different than Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws, if you remember, are segregation laws. Yes?
What is that?
Right after the Civil War, black codes. Now, Jim Crow laws, they come in, I would say probably in 1870s. They start to come in, and they're really part of the culture by 1880. And that's where you have like white drinking fountains, black drinking fountains, white railroad cars, black railroad cars, schools, everything is segregated. Okay, now we have certain numbers of amendments that are passed. 13 amendment is against slavery. Okay, so 13 is passed right at the end of the Civil War. 14 and 15 are both under Johnson. 14 says ex-slaves are now citizens. And 15 gives black men the right to vote. And you remember, girls, what we talked about. The fact is that 15 is the right to vote, 14 is citizenship, 13 is against slavery, or eliminate slavery. Okay, so remember, girls, the women gave up the women's rights to help the abolitionists, and they get nothing. Yes? 13, 14, and 15. Think of it as a hierarchy. 13 is the lowest, that's the basic right that gets rid of slavery. 14 is the next right, which is citizenship for blacks, ex-slaves. And 15, right to vote. So each one of them is progressively like a bigger right. Okay, now, Andrew Johnson, he's not a very well-liked man. So they impeach him for lots and lots of miscellaneous political reasons of which you don't really need to know. Except you do need to know the Tenure of Office Act. In Mr. Lincoln's cabinet, there was a radical Republican. So when Mr. Lincoln dies, the radical Republican stays on. And so Johnson wants to get rid of him, but the radical Republicans do not want him off the cabinet. So they make a new rule, because no one likes Johnson, they make a new law, an act, that says the tenure of office, that you have to check with the House of Representatives before you can fire one of your cabinet members. That's not constitutional. But they passed it anyway, and of course he fired the guy, and they put him up for impeachment. He was impeached. He was found innocent of the impeachment by 1 vote. Okay? So remember, impeachment just means charges. When he's innocent of the impeachment, who decides whether he's innocent or guilty? The Senate. The Senate. The Supreme Court Justice is the one that presides, but they do not vote. The Senate decides. House of Representatives are the ones that set up the impeachment proceedings. They file the charges. The Senate tries it. Okay?
What if you're found guilty?
I don't know. We've never had one. Yes, Casey?
When was the tenure of office act?
Tenure of Office Act was, I want to make sure I get the date right, 67? Yes, 67. All right. So, in 1868, by the way, he only serves 1 term, obviously. And, okay, I need you to be quiet. Don't be talking. The last thing some people need to be doing.
Next to the declaration.
Yes.
Some thought that Yorktown was
Civil War.
I don't want to know. All right, so beginning of the Gilded Age. Okay, remember? All right, who can remember from today's discussion? Dates of the Gilded Age? The 96, right. Now, you're going to see it different in different books, but I want you to know that if you use 1869 to 1896, you can remember it easier. See? They even like it. 69 to 96. If you remember that, it will help you. The Gilded Age means looks great from the outside, but it's corrupt on the inside, which means there's lots of wealth, there's lots of really important things, but there's also a lot of corruption. Okay? So, I'm going to try again with the Gilded Age right now, and we're going to see how well that goes. I hope better than today. All right, during the early Gilded Age, there are still problems, obviously, in the South. There are the carpetbaggers and the scallywags. And remember, the carpetbaggers are the people that come from... I'm serious, you guys. If you're going to talk, you need to go outside. I'm tired. I'm tired of talking. But I really do want to help you, and I can help you, but I really can't talk over you. All right, so carpetbaggers are people from the north who come down to take advantage of Southerners and their property. So if you remember from Gone with the Wind, when they go down to the south, there's a person with a carpetbagger who tries to come and buy taro. They come and try to buy land cheap and take advantage of it. Scallywags are Southerners who agree with the North about rights for blacks. So again, 15th Amendment says blacks can vote. They're going to vote Republican Party. What is the South? Democrats. So the idea of this being able to vote is going to be really, really important. Now, scallywags are Southerners who agree with the North about the blacks' right to vote. Okay, the other thing you need to know about this time period is that this is when, and actually it's during Johnson, that they send, well, right at the beginning of, I guess before, at the middle of Johnson and Grant, they send the military down to make sure that blacks are getting the rights to vote. Okay, so they come up with military, different areas, and they use the military to enforce the rights. Now that military is going to be really important because these districts are going to enforce the civil rights of blacks. And guess who supports that? Radical Republicans. Now, as soon as the Radical Republican leader, Thaddeus Stevens, dies, that political faction of the Republicans is going to also die. So once he dies, which is going to be very soon in our story, the Radical Republicans are going to kind of die out, and military reconstruction is going to go with it. And guess what year? 1876 is when the military is going to be pulled out. Yes. Okay. Now, what's the question? All right. So speaking of 1876, there is, and you know, with Grant, you can remember the fact that he was a nice man, probably a good man, but he didn't really have very good friends. So he's the one that has a couple of the scandals. So we want to remember the Credit Mobilier, because during Grant's time, they are building the Transcontinental Railroad. And in 1869, at the beginning of the Gilded Age, is when it's over, is when the Transcontinental Railroad is finished. So during Grant's term, there is this thing called the Credit Mobilier. Someone sets up a fake company. They bill the government that they've built railroad track, and they really haven't built it, and they pocket the money. So it's a scam. But they couldn't bust anybody because everyone in Congress had bought shares in the stock. So it was very hard to bust that thing up. Okay, the second one was the whiskey ring. The idea that people were supposed to be collecting taxes on whiskey, instead they were pocketing the money. Okay, so Grant was known pretty much as, nice man, not a very good president. Okay, and he is way down the list of good presidents. Way down the list. All right, so we want to remember the next election. The next election is 76. Now, that is going to be, a lot of people compare that to the election of 2000. Okay, so what happens is there's some questionable ballots in Florida and some of the southern states in 76, and that's between Tilden and Hayes. Hayes is the Republican, Tilden is the Democrat. Tilden is ahead, but because of some maneuvering, Hayes ends up winning the election, But the deal is, they'll give him the votes if he takes the military out of the South. So remember, the Democrats want the military out of the South because they don't like the military telling them what to do. So the deal was, Hayes, who's a Republican, can be president, but only if he takes the military out. They made a deal. So in 1876, we call that the end of Reconstruction. And that's important to know. So if you have a Reconstruction question, you can say 65 to 76. And Sophia, you can remember 76. That is never going to get old, by the way. Okay. All right. So in 1870s, okay, there's a couple of different themes you're going to want to remember. In the 1870s, this is the time when there's a lot of inventions, okay? So if you can remember, right at the end, at the beginning of Hayes, there's going to be a lot of inventions to 1900. So 1877 to 1900, there's a ton of inventions. Now, why is that going to be important? You can remember, this is going to change the city. And by 1900, there's going to be more people living in the city than in the countryside. Okay? That's going to be important. Okay? So, in if we look at Thomas Edison with the light bulb, some of you might forget how important and how early that really is. The light bulb was actually invented in 1878. It doesn't come into real being until, as far as lighting up cities, until probably 1890. But it's important to know that you could light up cities by 1890s, which is going to change the difference between living in the country and living in the city, because the countryside does not get it. Okay, Westinghouse. Some of you might not know who he was, but he does. Yes, but he also did electricity. Early electricity, Westinghouse does. Early electricity. Of course, Henry Ford in the 1890s starts to come up with the assembly line. Remember, he does not invent the car. He does not invent the assembly line. He puts them together. Okay, that's his claim to fame. He doesn't invent the car. He invents putting the car was actually invented in Europe. So he puts them together. Thank you. Okay. So those are the big industries. All right. So what else is happening with these inventions? I'm trying to get you to see this as a big kind of family here. So with the inventions comes the importance of the factory. With the importance of the factory comes these new people that are coming in, and meanwhile, and coming in at a very quick clip through the 1870s, these new kind of immigrants. You're going to have the poor Irish. You're going to have then the Eastern Europeans that come in. Remember the dark people from Eastern Europe, the people that are anarchist and socialist. And so some of them are going to be coming in because there's lots of upheaval in Eastern Europe. And you're going to have the Russians, and they're mostly going to be Jewish. And you're going to have Asians, and where are they going to be coming in? Angel Island, right, off San Francisco. You're going to have the Eastern Europeans coming in. Ellis Island in New York. Okay. All right. With those immigrants, now you're going to have a cheap labor source for our big three. Our big three are steel, which is whom? Carnegie. Rockefeller with oil. And J.P. Morgan with banks. Now, there's a fourth one really to remember, is that's Vanderbilt. And Vanderbilt is the railroad. Yes, he's the one that puts the gauge. Right. Okay, yeah.
The big three again?
Okay, well actually they're the big four, but we moved on. Okay, so number one, and I'm going to tell you other information you need to listen. Okay, so Rockefeller, he's the one, remember the political cartoon that had the rose? Okay, Rockefeller is, and remember, he's horizontal integration. He picks off one company after another. Then you have Carnegie, who's got vertical. He takes every level of the production. And then you've got the interlocking directorate with J.P. Morgan, who puts somebody of his company into every one of the different, the board of directors. Thank you. Okay, did that answer your question?
What did Rockefeller do?
Oil.
Oil, that's right.
Yeah, I'm going to kill you. All right, so could the corporations have done anything without the immigrants? No. Could the immigrants have done anything without the corporations? Probably not. Now remember, this is laissez-faire, meaning there's no real, any kind of restrictions on how big the companies can get. So, now, why could these companies get so big? Because the presidents didn't care. Nobody cared. And the idea was, let businesses be as big as they want to. There's no restrictions at all. Republicans did not believe in any restrictions, and we know all of our presidents in the Gilded Age are
Republicans.
yes, except for Cleveland. All right. So what are some of the Supreme Court cases that you might need to know? First of all, maybe I better let's do the unions first. Let's do the unions first. Okay. So when you have these impact of all these people, and you have these big corporations, pretty soon you're going to see a need for some unions, for some help. Okay, so the first union, nope, Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor. And they were created in 1877. So when we think of the end of Reconstruction, it's the beginning of the labor unions. Okay, so, yeah.
What year was that?
1877, listen up. So 1877, Knights of Labor, they were destroyed by the Haymarket Square, because remember, that union had women, it had minorities, it had everybody in one big union. Everybody was allowed to come in. Well, as it turns out, they get associated with, and they end up losing any kind of power. And remember, their leader was Terence Powderly. Lost the power with Powderly. Okay? So they were associated with anarchy. And remember, in the United States, we do not like that violence. So any kind of violence then is going to be associated with unions and labor. Okay, so the second union that comes up right after that is the AFL. Okay, and the AFL is Mr. Gompers in 18... It comes about 1870s, 1880s, okay? 80s, 86. Okay, 86. And remember, Mr. Gompers. And then we also have the third one, which is the IWW. It's going to come a little later, the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies. And they were socialists. Okay, they're going to be really active during World War I. What? No, they did not like war.
The industrial or international?
International Workers of the World. Industrial work, either one works, depending on where you are. Yes, I won't work, right. Okay, important strikes, you gotta know them. Important strikes. Probably the most important one is the Pullman strike. And the Pullman strike was in 1894, why are you still talking? 1894 is the Pullman strike. Remember, the Pullman were people who worked on the railroad. And the Pullman strike, you need to remember it because it had Eugene Debs, who was the head of the railroad union. And Eugene Debs was a socialist. And he made sure that they had they weren't working. Remember, Pullman were people who worked on the sleeping cars. So what happened is Cleveland sent in the military because he said they were keeping the mail from being delivered. So every single strike ends in disaster for the workers. Up until 1904, when the anthracite coal strike with TR comes into being, then there's finally some success. But up to that point, no union really gets much of anything.
What year is the Pullman strike? 1890?
1894, yes. Coal strike 1904.
Who was the president of the military?
Cleveland. Yes. Okay. So, what are some of the thought process? Do you have a question, Christian? Okay. What are some of the thought processes that were going on that enabled all this wealth to be accumulated? Okay. A couple of things for this. Social Darwinism. The idea that you had money because God gave it to you and you were survival of the fittest. It was basically survival of the fittest for people. Okay? You get money because you are more fit to do it. So if you don't have it, it's because you're not fit. You're probably lazy. Remember Acres of Diamonds? Remember the idea that you can go out and find it if you want it, but you just don't have it. You're not going to be able to get it because you're that lazy. So the idea of, and the gospel of wealth with Andrew Carnegie. Yes, according to the Bible, I have the most, but I also have an obligation to help others. Remember, that whole idea of the gospel of wealth was, remember Carnegie was the rags to riches guy? He started with nothing. He's the only one really that happened to. So social Darwinism, you need to know that. Okay, now, those are kind of the concepts of that. So what happens when these people get so wealthy? They have to somehow find a way to harness this because it's getting out of control. So they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. And you need to know that's 1890. Now, it didn't work very well because people used it to try to break up unions because they said unions were like monopolies. So it had a lot of loopholes. The Sherman Antitrust Act becomes later on during Wilson's term the Clayton Antitrust Act, which really works very well. Okay, during Wilson's term. Broke up unions.
What year was that?
1890. Okay. Now, a couple of things. We want to make sure that, and again, I'm going kind of back and forth on the Gilded Age. You want to make sure that you know the Pendleton Act. It's one of the few things that, and we talked about it in a few of the classes, nobody seemed to know the answer. I think there was one lousy person, not one wonderful person that knew. One good person that knew. Jake won that contest, Jeopardy. Okay, so the idea was the Pendleton Act. Garfield was assassinated. Chester Arthur became president and made a rule, a law called the Pendleton Act that said that you have to take a test in order to get a government position. You have to take a test. No longer is it going to be the spoil system, the idea that who you know is what the office you get. It's going to be merit-based. And remember, this was the time of the spoil system. Yes? Civil Service, 90, 80, 82. Okay. Now, also, what was one of the other problems during this time were the railroads. What? Remember, the railroads had everybody wrapped around them, especially the farmers. So in 1882, they passed this thing called the Interstate Commerce Act. Interstate Commerce Act, which said you have to post your rates, and you can't charge one person more than another person. You can't have kickbacks. You can't do anything that keeps it from being fair. And of course, remember, at this time in the 1880s is when the populists decided to start to pressure the government. And remember, the populists are from where? The farmers from the Midwest. Remember, Wizard of Oz? So the farmers are from the Midwest, like Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado. They are putting pressure on the government to take... I'm not stopping again. If I stop, I'll just stop. Okay, you guys over here, if you're going to come on Friday, you're going to all break up. I can't have it. You're all talking. And no, not me. I never talk. It's the first time I ever talked. Okay. All right, so the populists really wanted the government to take over the railroads. They wanted the government to run all the things because they felt that the railroads and other people were taking advantage of the farmers. Okay, and the farmers also wanted silver. Remember Dorothy's shoes? The silver, okay? They wanted silver. So it's 16 pieces of silver to 1 piece of gold. So they could inflate the money. And remember, they had this big silver mine they found in Colorado, the silver lode, and they wanted it to be added to that so that they could have 16 to 1 so they could pay their debts off. Okay, so farmers, remember, who is their leader? William Jennings Bryan, the Lion, right. So the populists are going to be swallowed up by the Democrats later on. They are going to never have a president, but they have lots and lots of senators. They have a lot of political power in the 1880s and 90s. Okay? 1880s and 90s. The drought is over in the 90s. Okay? So you want to remember that. By the 90s, the issue is pretty much swallowed up. The idea of these monopolies and things are swallowed up by the Democrats. They help. So the populist movement dies out. Okay. Jim Crow laws, we talked about that. Sharecropping, we talked about that. Okay, Carnegie Steel. We want to talk about a couple of, we talked about the Pullman strike, which was the railroad strike. Let's talk about Carnegie and a couple of other strikes. Carnegie Steel, there was a strike against them in 1892. Think of the 90s. We call them the naughty 90s because there were lots of bad things that happened in the 90s. There was lots of problems with the drought. There were lots of problems with panics over, too much coinage. There were all kinds of problems in the 90s. So in the 90s, there's lots of strikes. Remember, we wondered if we asked Cleveland if he would want that second term if he knew what he knew now. Probably not. So what does Cleveland do? The Carnegie Steel, what's happening in the 90s? The economy is going down. And so what does Carnegie do with his homestead? He has his own town. He raises their rent, but what else does he do? He also makes them pay to go on the train to go to work in the steel plant, but he doesn't raise their pay. So they strike. And what does he do? He fires them all and starts over again. Okay? So why is that important? It shows the power of the monopoly. Because did those people have any skills? Not really. They were easily replaceable. There's plenty of people in order to take their place. Okay, so think of the 90s as being the time of the strikes. Okay, you guys thinking? This is not beyond you. You're young yet. Yes. Okay. All right, another thing that happens in the 90s that Cleveland's not real happy with is Coxey's Army. All of those people in the 90s, in 1890, said, wait a minute. We didn't get paid our bonus for fighting in the Civil War. We want it now. Things are not good. So remember, Coxey's Army comes to, and why do they get arrested?
Because they go on the White House lawn.
That's right. They go on the White House lawn, and Cleveland is freaked out, and he says, get them off the White House lawn. So what does he do later? He gives them jobs later, these veterans, but not while they're demanding it. So he gets rid of them. It's a big mess. And yet later on, he gives them jobs. Okay, Coxey's Army. What's that?
Under Cleveland?
Under Cleveland. All bad things happen under Cleveland. Yes. Yes. Question? Nope? Okay. All right. So out of this period comes lots of problems. And one of the problems is that people are moving to the city. There's lots and lots of overcrowding in tenements. Remember, this is the time of the dumbbell tenement that's supposed to be better for you, but I'm not so sure it is. This is the time of the skyscrapers. They're all tall because they now have steel. These are bridges. This is also the time of Boss Tweed in New York. Remember, he is the one who runs the city. Even though he doesn't have any offices, he makes sure that he runs the city. He is then exposed by Thomas Nast, the cartoonist. Any cartoons, you guys, from this time period, whether it be about the treatment of the Chinese in California, whether it be about anything in this time period, is going to be Thomas Nast. Okay? Don't forget, because this is also the time we're looking at the problems in the cities, but we're also looking at the problem of the Chinese in California. And this is also in 1880s when they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. That says only Chinese that are skilled can come in. Unskilled Chinese may not come into California. And it lasts to 1920s. Yes. Supposed to only last for 10 years, but it lasts a lot longer. Whether you have a business. Remember the little video I showed you about the woman? She was telling about her family, and she looked real white at the end. She's the one who said they brought all of the family in by saying that they were owners. Yeah. 1880s. Yeah. Okay, so Boss Tweed. Don't forget, Boss Tweed, this is also when immigrants are coming in, post-Civil War. This is just a mess. Okay, and the cities are corrupt. Remember, this is when they have this is the jungle time, you guys. This is the muckraker time. Okay, don't forget, write down muckrakers. Muckrakers. Because they're going to come around the cities and they're going to look to see what kinds of terrible things are going on, but they do not have a solution. So let's talk about some of those authors. So Tarbell, Ida Tarbell, she writes about Standard Oil. We can talk about Jacob Riis. He takes pictures of the tenements. Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S. I showed you a whole bunch of pictures by him. Okay, name me another one. Upton Sinclair called The Jungle, about meat packing and how disgusting it is. Okay? I thought that was a small chicken. Yes. What's that? The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. Okay, now, if you know 3 of them, at least you have an idea of, if you don't know all of them, you don't have to, but you definitely need to know those 3. You could know Spargo, talking about the bitter cry of the children, which is about coal mining. But you need to have an arsenal of a few names. So if you wrote an essay, Dylan, that you know what it's about. Okay? So, all right. So you have all of these people that are writing about, and this is also the literature of realism. Everything after Civil War is realism. Remember Huckleberry Finn? Remember, this is also the time of Jack London. These are people that are going to tell it like it is. Red Badge of Courage. These are people that are going to say, you know what, things are not cool. This is not a romantic comedy. This is real life. Okay? All right. So after this comes progressive. Right. So we have problems. Now we better find someone to solve them. The progressives. Okay. So the progressives are going to be people that look at the problems and say, you know what, I have answers for those. So it would be like Jane Addams with the settlement houses, where she builds things to help the immigrants. This is also going to be Bob La Follette, who says, you know what, we need to have a secret ballot. It's not enough that we just vote and let everybody see what our ballot looks like. We need to have a secret ballot. Okay? Who else? Yeah, La Follette. L-A-F-O-L-L-E-T-T-E. La Follette, if you want to do French. L-A-F-O-L-L-E-T-T-E. Okay, and La Follette also passes the 17th Amendment, which is the direct election of senators. Okay, so you've got these progressives that are writing books. They are discussing things so that things can get better. These are also, okay, I need to be quiet. This is also the time of Frederick Turner. And remember who Frederick Turner was? We talked about Frederick Jackson Turner, the frontier. This is the time when he is writing about, okay, how are we going to define the American character? We've always defined the American character by going west. How are we going to define it now? The West is already settled. Yes? I'm sorry? Income tax. Yeah. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay. All right. So the idea of Frederick Jackson Turner talking about that. Okay. The other thing of the sort of ideas during this time are the 2 black leaders. You need to know them. Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. Absolutely have to know them. Those are the 2 sort of competing views of black civil rights. So we're talking about 1880s, 1890s and there. They are both talking. Booker T. Washington wrote a book called Up From Slavery. He was a slave. He was the one who said that we should gradually be accepted into white society. You can't force white people to like us, but we can have equal economic success. Yes?
Who was the third very radical person at the same time?
Garvey, Marcus Garvey. He's the Back to Africa guy.
Yeah.
Okay, so Booker T. Washington says we're going to do gradual. We want there to be economic success. W.B. Du Bois said we want it all right now. We want it all right now, and in fact, if you don't give it to me right now, I'm going to go to Ghana. And he did. Okay, so he also starts the organization called the NAACP, along with, who's the other person? Ida Wells. She was against what? Yes, and who wouldn't be? All right. Also, during this time, those of you who read Tree Grows in Brooklyn, this is also the time of Margaret Sanger, the birth control lady. Okay? So she is also in the tenements trying to get people to think about birth control.
Who's that? Who's that lady?
Margaret Sanger. Okay. Sanger. S-A-N-G-E-R. All right. So, last thing. You guys can do it. You're almost there. All right. So, McKinley dies. He's assassinated by a crazy person. And I can't say his name because it starts with a W and it has lots and lots of consonants. Okay, so McKinley is killed, TR takes over. Theodore Roosevelt, of course, is a Republican, just like all of the other people in the Gilded Age, except he is not going to be the Gilded Age. He's going to take the ideas of the muckrakers and he's going to be the first progressive president. He's going to say, I'm going to use the government for the good of the people. And he comes up with his square deal. And the square deal has 3 C's. Okay? Consumerism, protecting the consumer, getting rid of corporations, bad corporations, and conservation. Okay, 3 C's. So I'm going to take each one of them and tell you what he did. Because I know it so well. Okay, I'll tell you each one of them. Okay, so consumerism. He does the meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, both of which inspected meat and made sure that when you sold medicine, you didn't sell just a bottle of alcohol. Okay? Pure Food and Drug Act. Meat Inspection Act, Pure Food and Drug Act. Okay? Then, for corporations, he's going to be the trust buster. He's going to get rid of bad trusts, and he's going to start with the Northern Securities Corporation, which is a railroad. Okay? So he's going to be the trust buster. Remember that. Conservation, he doubles the number of national parks. And his big buddy is another John Muir. He's another progressive, John Muir. Remember, John Muir loves the Yosemite National Park. Okay, that's his thing.
Fun fact, TR's ideals of conservation actually made the Boy Scouts the largest youth organization in the U.S. at the time.
Wow, excellent. And we know he was a member. Okay, next one. He is, the next thing you want to remember about him. He had a couple of ideas. Okay, listen up. He has a couple of ideas. Oh, and I forgot the whole, darn it. Okay, let me go back. Okay, I forgot like this big thing. Okay, during McKinley's term, let's go back for a second. During McKinley's term, I forgot the Spanish-American War. You guys, this is on YouTube, so let's try to keep it short here. Yes.
When was Theodore that case?
He wasn't. He just took over. 1900. Okay. Okay, he took over because McKinley was assassinated, JC. Okay, let's go back. McKinley is right before Roosevelt. Remember, before McKinley is killed, before McKinley is killed, he does have a term, part of a term. Oh, Spanish-American War is when?
Somewhere in the 1900s.
1898.
Oh, I wasn't even.
If you remember 1900, that's pretty darn good. Okay, so 1898. One of the things I want you to remember, and I don't know why I didn't even think about this, but one of the important books about this time is Alfred Mahan's influence of sea power. Sea power. So during this time, they decide that the best way to create a powerful country was to have the best navy. Best navy. Okay, that's important. So when McKinley is president, TR is part of. He's out in the before he becomes vice president. He is out with the Navy, and he decides that it would be really good if the United States had a nice little war, And Cuba was having trouble because they were having bad Spanish leadership. And so the United States was trying to interfere a bit. Remember, we had already interfered a bit with Hawaii, but Cleveland had given Hawaii back to Queen Lulukalani. So we lost out on that, at least for a while, until McKinley comes. I know I say it all wrong. Okay, so what happens then is that the United States decides that we're going to go in and help Cuba. And so TR goes in as a Rough Rider, remember, to the Spanish-American War. But the important part I want you to remember is the development of yellow press. And remember, yellow press means the exaggeration of facts. And William Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer were both yellow press guys. They were vying for publishing, you know, for them to get their newspapers published and sold at a higher amount.
Can you repeat their names?
Pulitzer, like the Pulitzer Prize, and Hearst, as in Hearst Castle.
This is Yellow Press.
Yellow press people. They are the publishers. If you'd seen Newsies, you would know. Okay, it's about it. All right, so we go into Cuba. And because we win in Cuba, it's a splendid little war. It lasts like 3 months. We have more die of disease than die from getting shot. So we get out of that war a couple things. Number one, we get Puerto Rico. We get Guam. And we buy the Philippines. So we buy the Philippines, and if you remember correctly, we discussed this at quite a length. We were trying to be imperialistic like many of the other countries during this time period. Remember from world history, they talked a lot about imperialism in the 1880s and 90s. Okay, so we are getting in that because now we have our own place called the Philippines. Now we have a 3-year war, and remember it's called the First Vietnam. Because it is terrible, it's terrible between each other, we lose thousands of men, and it's just a terrible war. The Filipinos lose thousands of men, and it's one of those wars that we're really embarrassed about because we fight the very people we promised their independence to. So, Philippines, when did they become independent? After World War II, right. Okay, well we didn't need them anymore. Okay, so during McKinley's term, we also get Hawaii. So we get Hawaii and we get the Philippines during McKinley's term before he gets killed. Okay, then TR takes over and we have the 3 Cs. And he has the square deal. He also has the Roosevelt Corollary. And remember, the Roosevelt Corollary is an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine says you stay in your hemisphere, we'll stay in ours. And we say, under the Roosevelt Corollary, yes, but. Well, if the country in the Western Hemisphere cannot defend itself, we will get in to help them. Okay, so that's the Roosevelt Corollary. And basically when you see the political cartoons, you've seen 1,000 of them, that the United States is mostly concerned about the Caribbean and about Spain or some of those other countries coming into the Caribbean and taking back over different areas. Yes?
Are there going to be any political cartoons on multiple choice at all?
Oh, I'm sure there will be. I mean, you've seen them in yours, right? Your practice ones? But the good part is, there you will definitely have one. I mean, they're a good thing, because they give you hints on things. You'll definitely have one on your DBQ. I can guarantee that. You may have a map on your multiple choice, but you'll definitely have a picture of some sort. Or a graph or something. Okay, yeah.
Did we get Hawaii?
1898. Alaska was, I forgot to mention Alaska. Alaska was in Andrew Johnson's term. But it becomes a state in 1959.
As does Hawaii.
As does Hawaii. Okay. Have you guys had enough?
Yeah.
All right. I think we can end here and pick up the, we're almost at World War I. So we can pick that up. That's what I was going to start with next time anyway. I have a little bit more of the progressives, but I'm sensing that you're on overload. So it doesn't do you any good to just sit here if you're not, can't absorb it. Okay, go home and study that stuff.